Charlotte's Bold Move, Part 1. The grand halls of Buckingham Palace echoed with whispered conversations as Queen Consort Charlotte made her way through the ornate corridors. Her silk heels clicked against the marble floors, each step carrying the weight of royal expectation and centuries of tradition. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows, casting golden shadows across the tapestries that had witnessed countless royal dramas throughout history. Charlotte had always been different from the previous queen consorts. Where others had maintained quiet dignity and followed protocol without question, she brought a fire that sometimes burned too bright for the ancient institution. Her marriage into the royal family had been met with both celebration and concern, as courtiers whispered about her independent spirit and occasional disregard for the more restrictive royal customs. On this particular morning, Charlotte was already feeling the pressure of recent public criticism. The newspapers had been harsh in their coverage of her latest charitable initiative, questioning whether her approach was too modern for the monarchy. The weight of constant scrutiny had been building for weeks, and even the usually composed queen consort was beginning to show signs of strain. As she approached the private dining room for her morning briefing with palace staff, Charlotte noticed something that immediately set her on edge. Standing rigidly at attention near the entrance was Royal Guard Sergeant Thomas Mitchell, a man she had come to view as emblematic of everything wrong with the palace's outdated approach to protocol. Mitchell had been serving the royal family for over 15 years, and his unwavering adherence to tradition often clashed with Charlotte's more progressive ideas. Their previous encounters had been tense, with the guard consistently enforcing rules that Charlotte felt were unnecessarily restrictive and outdated. The tension between them had been building for months. During state functions, Mitchell would position himself in ways that Charlotte felt were deliberately obstructive. When she tried to interact more naturally with guests, breaking from formal receiving line protocols, Mitchell would step forward with subtle corrections that embarrassed her in front of important visitors. Just last week, during a charity gala, Charlotte had attempted to move freely among the guests, wanting to create a more relaxed atmosphere. Mitchell had intercepted her path multiple times, gesturing toward the prescribed route that kept her isolated from genuine interaction. The incident had left Charlotte feeling caged and frustrated with the suffocating nature of royal protocol. The palace staff had noticed the growing friction between the queen consort and the veteran guard. Some sympathized with Charlotte's desire for modernization, while others felt that Mitchell was simply doing his duty to maintain the dignity and security that royal protocol demanded. The divide was creating an uncomfortable atmosphere among the household staff. As Charlotte entered the dining room that morning, she could feel Mitchell's presence behind her, his measured footsteps maintaining the precise distance required by protocol. The sound grated against her nerves, a constant reminder of the invisible chains that bound her every movement within the palace walls. The morning briefing began routinely enough, with Charlotte's private secretary discussing the day's schedule and upcoming engagements. However, Charlotte found it difficult to concentrate, her attention repeatedly drawn to Mitchell's imposing figure stationed just outside the doorway. His rigid posture and unwavering focus seemed to mock her every attempt to bring warmth and humanity to her royal duties. During a discussion about an upcoming children's hospital visit, Charlotte suggested deviating from the planned route to spend more time in the pediatric ward. Her secretary explained that such changes would require security clearance and protocol adjustments, gesturing toward Mitchell as the final authority on such matters. The implication that this guard held such power over her actions sparked something deep within Charlotte. She had endured months of feeling micromanaged and constrained, watching as her genuine desire to connect with people was repeatedly thwarted by rigid adherence to tradition. As the briefing concluded and staff members began filing out of the room, Charlotte remained seated, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The frustration that had been simmering beneath the surface was now threatening to boil over. She could hear Mitchell's voice in the hallway, giving instructions to other guards with the authority that seemed to supersede even her own wishes. The breaking point was approaching, though neither Charlotte nor the unsuspecting guard could have predicted how dramatically the morning would unfold. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock the entire palace establishment and challenge the very foundations of royal protocol. Charlotte's Bold Move, Part 2, the moment that would change everything, began with what seemed like a simple request. Charlotte rose from her chair with renewed determination and walked toward the hallway where Sergeant Mitchell stood consulting his security briefing notes. Her approach was measured, but those who knew her well would have recognized the dangerous glint in her eyes. "Sergeant Mitchell," Charlotte called out, her voice carrying the authority of her position. "I need to speak with you about tomorrow's hospital visit." Mitchell turned with military precision, offering the customary bow before meeting her gaze. "Your Majesty, the security arrangements have been finalized according to standard protocol. The route has been cleared and—" "I want to change the route," Charlotte interrupted, her tone sharper than usual. "I want to spend additional time in the children's cancer ward, away from the media areas." The guard's expression remained professionally neutral, but Charlotte could see the familiar flicker of resistance in his eyes. "Your Majesty, such changes would require extensive security reviews. The current arrangement ensures optimal safety and—" "I don't care about optimal safety," Charlotte snapped, her frustration finally breaking through her composed facade. "I care about connecting with those children in a meaningful way, not parading through like some distant figurehead." Mitchell straightened further if that was possible, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that had infuriated Charlotte countless times before. "Your Majesty, with respect, my duty is to ensure your protection. The protocols exist for good reason, established through years of experience and—" "Experience?" Charlotte's voice rose, causing several passing staff members to slow their steps and glance nervously in their direction. "You mean the experience of keeping the royal family isolated from real human connection?" The hallway had grown quieter as more staff became aware of the escalating tension. Palace employees who had worked there for decades had rarely witnessed such direct confrontation between a royal family member and a guard. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. Mitchell maintained his rigid posture, but there was something in his expression that pushed Charlotte beyond her breaking point. It was the look of patient condescension, the same expression she had endured from countless palace officials who treated her like a child who didn't understand the serious business of monarchy. "Your Majesty," Mitchell continued in that maddeningly calm tone, "perhaps we could schedule a meeting with the security team to discuss—" "No." The word exploded from Charlotte with such force that it echoed off the marble walls. "I am tired of meetings about meetings, tired of protocols that serve no one except those who want to maintain control." Her hands trembled with rage as months of suppressed frustration poured out. "Do you think I'm some fragile ornament that needs to be protected from reality? Do you think my only purpose is to smile and wave from a safe distance?" Mitchell's professional mask began to slip slightly, revealing his own frustration with what he clearly viewed as royal petulance. "Your Majesty, my job is to—" "Your job," Charlotte interrupted, stepping closer to the guard, "is supposed to be protecting me, not imprisoning me. But you seem to have forgotten the distinction." The tension had reached a critical point. Other guards in the vicinity had noticed the commotion and were beginning to position themselves strategically, unsure whether to intervene or maintain their posts. The palace staff who had gathered were frozen between their duty to continue working and their natural curiosity about this unprecedented scene. Charlotte's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I have watched you undermine my authority, question my judgment, and treat me like an inconvenience for months. You position yourself like some self-appointed guardian of tradition, but what you're really guarding against is progress." Mitchell's jaw tightened, and for the first time, his professional composure cracked slightly. "Your Majesty, I have served this family faithfully for 15 years. I have never shown anything but respect." "Respect?" Charlotte laughed bitterly. "You call it respect when you block my path at public events? When you signal to other staff that my wishes are secondary to your interpretation of protocol?" The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Mitchell's face flushed slightly. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was impossible to tell. The gathered staff held their breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Charlotte took another step forward, closing the distance between them until she was uncomfortably close to the guard's personal space. Her eyes blazed with an intensity that made even the veteran soldier take an almost imperceptible step backward. "I am done," she said through gritted teeth, "being managed by someone who thinks tradition is more important than humanity." Her voice grew louder again, carrying throughout the corridor. "I am done with your subtle insubordination and your passive-aggressive enforcement of rules that you seem to think supersede my authority. The confrontation had escalated, beyond anything the palace staff had ever witnessed. In the hushed corridors where even raised voices were rare, Charlotte's passionate outburst was seismic. The question now was not whether something dramatic would happen, but how far the Queen Consort was prepared to go to make her point. Mitchell stood his ground, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now, as if he was finally realizing that this was not going to end with a polite royal retreat. Charlotte's bold move, Part 3. The moment when everything changed happened faster than anyone could have anticipated. Charlotte's anger had reached a boiling point, and in that instant of pure frustration, her hand moved with shocking swiftness toward Sergeant Mitchell's face. The slap never connected. Mitchell's military training kicked in automatically, his hand shooting up to catch Charlotte's wrist mid-swing. For a frozen moment, the Queen Consort and the Royal Guard stood locked in this unprecedented position, her arm suspended in the air between them, his fingers wrapped around her wrist with practiced efficiency. The hallway fell into absolute silence. The dozen or so palace staff members who had witnessed the scene stood paralyzed with shock. No one had ever seen anything like this in the centuries-old institution of the British monarchy. A Queen Consort attempting to strike a guard physically restraining a member of the royal family. It was unthinkable. Charlotte's eyes widened as the reality of what she had just done hit her. The rage that had driven her to such an extreme action suddenly transformed into shock at her own behavior. She had crossed a line that no royal should ever cross, regardless of the provocation. Mitchell held her wrist for only a second longer than necessary, his own shock evident in his eyes. His training had taught him to react instinctively to any threat, but nothing had prepared him for this situation. How do you handle a member of the royal family who has just attempted to assault you? Your Majesty, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Please. Charlotte yanked her wrist free, stumbling slightly backward. Her face had gone pale, the flush of anger replaced by the realization of what she had nearly done. Around them, the gathered staff remained motionless, as if moving might somehow make the situation more real. The head butler, Mr. Pembridge, who had been among the witnesses, finally found his voice. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should continue this discussion in private. But Charlotte shook her head violently, her composure completely shattered. No, she said, her voice breaking. Everyone has already seen what happened. There's no point in pretending otherwise. She looked around at the faces staring at her with mixtures of shock, concern, and barely concealed fascination. Some of the younger staff members had their phones in their hands, though none would dare to actually record what was happening. The older employees, veterans of royal service, looked as though they had witnessed the end of the world. I almost struck a guard, Charlotte said, her voice growing stronger despite the tremor in her hands. A man who was doing his job, however misguided I believe his methods to be. She turned to face Mitchell directly. I owe you an apology, Sergeant. Mitchell's professional mask had slipped entirely, revealing a man who was genuinely shaken by what had occurred. Your Majesty, perhaps we should— No, Charlotte interrupted again. I need to say this here in front of everyone who saw what happened. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I was wrong to raise my hand to you. There is no excuse for that behavior, regardless of my frustrations with palace protocol. The admission sent ripples through the assembled staff. Royal family members simply didn't apologize to guards, especially not in public corridors with witnesses present. The hierarchy that governed palace life had clear rules about such interactions, and Charlotte was breaking all of them. Mitchell looked uncomfortable with the attention and the unprecedented situation. Your Majesty, I understand that emotions can run high. Stop, Charlotte said firmly. Don't make excuses for me. What I did was inexcusable. She paused, looking around at the gathered faces again. But I want everyone here to understand something. My action was wrong, but my frustration is real. Her voice began to gain strength again, though this time it was controlled rather than angry. For months I have felt suffocated by protocols that seemed designed to prevent me from doing the job I was meant to do. I have been blocked from meaningful engagement with the people this family is supposed to serve. Mr. Pembridge stepped forward slightly. Your Majesty, perhaps this conversation would be better suited to a private meeting where it can be managed and minimized. Charlotte shook her head. No, Mr. Pembridge. These people have all been affected by the tension that led to this moment. They deserve to hear the truth. She turned back to Mitchell, who was still standing at attention despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Sergeant, you have served this family faithfully for 15 years. But service doesn't mean preventing change. It doesn't mean treating every new idea as a threat to tradition." The guard's jaw worked silently for a moment before he responded. "Your Majesty, my duty is to ensure your safety and maintain the dignity of the crown. Sometimes that requires enforcing protocols that may seem restrictive. And sometimes," Charlotte replied, "those same protocols prevent the crown from maintaining relevance with the people it serves." She gestured around the hallway. "Look at us, Sergeant. Look at what this rigid adherence to tradition has created. A queen consort nearly striking a guard because she feels trapped by the very institution she's supposed to represent." The weight of her words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing more than just a personal conflict between Charlotte and Mitchell. They were seeing the clash between centuries of tradition and the demands of a modern monarchy struggling to find its place in the contemporary world. Charlotte straightened her shoulders, some of her royal bearing returning despite the chaos of the moment. "This incident will be reported as it should be, but I want it understood that the blame lies with me, not with Sergeant Mitchell. He was doing his job as he understood it." The hallway remained silent as everyone processed what they had witnessed and what it might mean for the future of the palace dynamics. Charlotte's bold move. Part 4 word of the incident spread through Buckingham Palace faster than wildfire. Within an hour, every member of the household staff knew that Queen Consort Charlotte had attempted to slap Sergeant Mitchell in the main corridor. The story grew with each telling, though the core facts remained shocking enough without embellishment. Private Secretary James Worthington received the news while reviewing correspondence in his office. He immediately set down his papers and rubbed his temples, understanding that this was the kind of crisis that could define a reign. Protocol demanded that he inform the king immediately, but he also knew that proper damage control would require careful coordination. In the servants' quarters, the reaction was mixed. Some of the younger staff expressed sympathy for Charlotte's frustrations, whispering about times they had witnessed Sergeant Mitchell's rigid enforcement of protocols. Others, particularly those with longer service, were genuinely horrified that a member of the royal family had raised her hand to a guard. "15 years I've been here," muttered Mrs. Davies, the head housekeeper, as she folded linens with unusual vigor. "Never seen anything like it." The Queen Mother would be rolling in her grave. But in the kitchen, where the staff often spoke more freely, there was a different sentiment. "About time someone stood up to Mitchell," said one of the cooks quietly. "Man thinks he runs this palace, not the royals." The security team held an emergency meeting in their briefing room. The other guards were clearly uncomfortable with the situation, caught between loyalty to their colleague and respect for the royal family. Some questioned whether Mitchell had been too rigid in his interpretation of protocol, while others felt that any criticism of his methods was tantamount to undermining the entire security operation. Captain Reynolds, head of palace security, found himself in an impossible position. He had to protect both his guard and the reputation of the royal family, while also conducting a thorough investigation into what had actually occurred. Meanwhile, Charlotte had retreated to her private apartments, where she sat in stunned silence as the magnitude of what had happened settled over her. Her lady-in-waiting, Sarah Pemberton, sat nearby, unsure of what to say or do in such an unprecedented situation. "The newspapers will have a field day," Charlotte said finally, her voice hollow. "Queen Consort loses control, attacks palace guard. They'll paint me as unstable, unfit for the role." Sarah, who had served Charlotte for 3 years and genuinely cared for her, spoke carefully. "Ma'am, perhaps we should focus on managing the immediate situation before worrying about media coverage." But Charlotte knew better. In the age of social media and instant communication, news of palace drama could spread globally within hours. Even if no official statement was made, rumors and speculation would fill the void, often with details far worse than the truth. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. James Worthington entered with the measured steps of a man carrying bad news. "Your Majesty, I need to inform you that His Majesty has been briefed on this morning's incident. He would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience." Charlotte felt her heart sink further. She had dreaded this moment since the confrontation ended. "How do you explain to your husband, the king, that you nearly struck one of his guards in full view of the palace staff? How did he take the news?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Worthington's diplomatic training showed as he chose his words carefully. His Majesty expressed concern for all parties involved and requested a full report on the circumstances leading to the incident. Translation: the king was furious, but trying to remain objective until he understood the complete situation. Charlotte had been married to him long enough to read between the lines of palace speak. As if summoned by their conversation, another knock came at the door. This time it was a page announcing that His Majesty was ready to meet with the Queen Consort in his private study. Charlotte rose slowly, smoothing her dress and checking her appearance in the mirror. She looked composed, but her eyes betrayed the emotional turmoil of the morning's events. Sarah offered a supportive smile and a gentle squeeze of her hand before Charlotte left for what would undoubtedly be one of the most difficult conversations of her royal career. The walk to the king's study felt longer than usual. Palace staff she passed offered the usual bows and curtsies, but she could sense the difference in their demeanor. There was curiosity in their eyes and perhaps judgment. The news had clearly spread throughout the entire household. Outside the king's study, Charlotte paused to collect herself. Through the heavy oak door, she could hear the murmur of voices. Her husband was meeting with advisors, probably discussing how to handle the crisis she had created. When she was finally announced and entered the room, she found the king seated behind his desk with Captain Reynolds and James Worthington flanking him. Their expressions were serious but not hostile. Still, Charlotte felt like a child called to the principal's office. "Charlotte," the king said, rising from his chair. "Please sit down." His tone was neutral, neither warm nor cold, which somehow made Charlotte more nervous than outright anger would have. She took the offered chair, acutely aware that all eyes in the room were focused on her. "I understand there was an incident this morning," the king continued. "I'd like to hear your version of what happened." Charlotte took a deep breath and began to recount the events, starting with her growing frustration over the past months and culminating in the moment when she nearly struck Sergeant Mitchell. She left out nothing, accepting full responsibility for her actions while also explaining the circumstances that had led to such an extreme reaction. When she finished, the room remained silent for several long moments. The king studied her face, perhaps looking for signs of remorse or defiance. Captain Reynolds made notes, undoubtedly already crafting his official report. "Charlotte," the king finally said, his voice gentler than before, "what you did was serious. It cannot be dismissed or ignored." She nodded, having expected nothing less. "I understand that, and I accept whatever consequences are deemed appropriate." But even as she spoke, Charlotte realized that the consequences would extend far beyond personal punishment. This incident would change how she was perceived by the staff, by the media, and by the public. The question now was whether those changes would ultimately help or harm her ability to serve in her royal role. Charlotte's bold move. Part 5. The king leaned back in his chair, studying Charlotte with the careful attention of someone trying to understand not just what had happened, but why. Captain Reynolds and James Worthington remained silent, waiting for their sovereign to guide the direction of this unprecedented conversation. "Charlotte," the king said finally, "in all my years I have never heard of a royal family member raising their hand to a member of staff. This is completely outside the bounds of acceptable behavior." Charlotte felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "I know, and I am deeply ashamed of my actions. There is no excuse for what I did. However," the king continued, surprising everyone in the room, "I am also concerned about the circumstances that led to such an extreme reaction from you." He glanced at Captain Reynolds. "Captain, in your experience, is it normal for members of the royal family to feel so constrained by security protocols that they resort to such measures?" The captain shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your Majesty, security protocols exist for good reason. However, I acknowledge that there may be room for discussion about how those protocols are implemented and communicated." It was a diplomatic answer, but Charlotte could hear the underlying admission that perhaps Sergeant Mitchell's approach had been unnecessarily rigid. The king seemed to hear it too, because he nodded thoughtfully before continuing. "James," he addressed his private secretary, "what is your assessment of the staff reaction to this incident?" Worthington consulted his notes. "The response has been mixed, Your Majesty. Some staff members have expressed shock at the Queen Consort's behavior. while others have privately indicated sympathy for her frustrations with certain security restrictions. Charlotte was surprised to learn that she had any support among the staff. She had assumed that everyone would be appalled by her loss of control. The king stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. "Charlotte, what you did was wrong and it cannot happen again. But I think this incident has exposed some underlying issues that we need to address." He turned back to face the room. "Captain Reynolds, I want a full review of our security protocols, particularly as they relate to the Queen Consort's public engagements. I want to understand whether we have been prioritizing rigid adherence to tradition over the practical needs of modern royal duties." Captain Reynolds nodded, though Charlotte could see he wasn't entirely comfortable with the implied criticism of his department. "Of course, Your Majesty. We will conduct a thorough review." "And Sergeant Mitchell?" Charlotte asked quietly. "What happens to him?" The king considered this. Sergeant Mitchell was doing his job as he understood it. He will not be disciplined for that. However, he and all security staff will be participating in additional training focused on collaborative problem-solving, rather than simply enforcing restrictions. Charlotte felt a wave of relief that Mitchell would not suffer professionally because of her actions. Whatever his faults, he had been trying to do his duty, and he deserved credit for his restraint in physically preventing her from striking him. "As for you, Charlotte," the king continued, his voice becoming more serious again, "there must be consequences for your behavior. Public consequences that demonstrate we take such incidents seriously." Charlotte's heart sank. Public consequences meant media attention, which meant the story would become fodder for tabloids and critics of the monarchy. "You will issue a formal apology to Sergeant Mitchell in front of the full palace staff," the king announced. "You will also participate in anger management counseling, which will be disclosed to demonstrate our commitment to addressing the underlying issues." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed this decision. Public apologies from royal family members were extremely rare, and the disclosure of counseling was almost unprecedented. But Charlotte realized that her husband was trying to turn a crisis into an opportunity for positive change. Furthermore, the king continued, "We will establish a new protocol review committee that includes input from all levels of palace staff. The Queen Consort will chair this committee, working directly with security and household management to create more flexible and responsive protocols." Charlotte looked up in surprise. Rather than being sidelined because of her behavior, she was being given a leadership role in addressing the very issues that had caused her frustration. James Worthington cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, how do we handle media inquiries about this incident?" The king had clearly thought about this already. "We will be transparent about what happened while focusing on the positive changes that will result. We will emphasize that even the royal family is not above self-reflection and improvement." It was a risky strategy, but Charlotte could see the wisdom in it. Rather than trying to hide or minimize the incident, they would use it as an example of accountability and modernization. "There is one more thing," the king said, turning to Charlotte. "Before you issue your public apology, I want you to speak privately with Sergeant Mitchell, not as Queen Consort to guard, but as one human being to another. He deserves to understand why you reacted as you did, and you need to hear his perspective on the situation." Charlotte nodded, feeling nervous about the prospect of facing Mitchell again so soon after their confrontation. But she recognized that her husband was right. A real resolution would require honest communication, not just formal protocols. Captain Reynolds and James Worthington were dismissed to begin implementing the king's decisions, leaving Charlotte alone with her husband for the first time since the incident occurred. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why are you giving me this opportunity instead of simply punishing me?" The king sat down across from her, his formal demeanor softening into something more personal. "Because I married a woman who cares deeply about connecting with people and making a positive difference. Those qualities shouldn't be suppressed by palace protocol. They should be channeled constructively." He reached across and took her hand. "What you did was wrong, Charlotte, but the passion that drove you to such extremes is also what makes you effective in your role. We just need to find better ways to harness that passion." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, grateful for her husband's understanding while still ashamed of her behavior. The path forward would not be easy, but for the first time since the incident, she felt hopeful that something positive might come from her moment of terrible judgment. Charlotte's bold move. Part 6. 3 hours later, Charlotte found herself standing outside the security office, preparing for what might be the most important conversation of her royal career. Captain Reynolds had arranged for her to meet privately with Sergeant Mitchell in a neutral room away from the main corridors where their earlier confrontation had occurred. When she entered the small conference room, Mitchell was already there, standing at attention despite the informal nature of the meeting. His expression was carefully neutral, but Charlotte could see the wariness in his eyes. "Sergeant Mitchell," she began, then paused. "May I call you Thomas? I think we've moved beyond formal titles for this conversation." Mitchell looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, Your Majesty." Charlotte gestured for him to sit, taking a chair across from him rather than at the head of the table. "Thomas, I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you an explanation and a genuine attempt to understand your perspective." Over the next hour, they talked with a candor that neither had expected. Charlotte explained her growing frustration with feeling constrained and ineffective in her role, while Mitchell shared his own struggles with balancing security requirements against the royal family's desire for authentic public engagement. "I've seen too many close calls over the years," Mitchell admitted. "Times when flexibility and protocol could have led to dangerous situations. I suppose I became overly cautious, but it came from genuine concern for your safety." Charlotte listened carefully, beginning to understand that his rigid enforcement hadn't been about power or control, but about fear of failing in his primary responsibility to protect her. "I never wanted to make you feel caged," he continued, "but when I see potential risks, my training kicks in. Maybe I stopped seeing the person behind the title, and maybe I stopped seeing the dedicated professional behind the uniform." Charlotte replied. "We both lost sight of the fact that we're on the same side." Their conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock. James Worthington entered to remind Charlotte that the palace staff was assembled for her formal apology. Word had spread that something significant was happening, and the main hall was fuller than usual for an all-staff meeting. As they walked toward the hall together, Mitchell spoke quietly. "Your Majesty, I want you to know that I hold no ill will about this morning's incident. I understand why you reacted as you did." Charlotte felt a wave of gratitude toward the guard who could have made the situation much worse by filing complaints or speaking to the media. "Thank you, Thomas. That means more than you know." The main hall fell silent as Charlotte entered. Every member of the palace household staff was present, from the most senior advisors to the newest kitchen assistants. The room held the weight of centuries of royal history, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Charlotte took her place at the front of the room, her heart pounding as she faced the assembled crowd. She could see a mixture of expressions: curiosity, concern, judgment, and in some faces, surprising support. "This morning," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I acted in a way that was completely unacceptable for anyone, but especially for a member of the royal family. I attempted to strike Sergeant Mitchell during a disagreement about security protocols." A murmur rippled through the crowd, though most had already heard the details through the palace grapevine. "There is no excuse for my behavior," Charlotte continued. "Regardless of my frustrations or disagreements, raising my hand to a member of staff was wrong, and I am deeply ashamed of my actions." She turned toward Mitchell, who stood at the side of the room. "Sergeant Mitchell, I offer you my sincere apology. You were doing your job with dedication and professionalism, and you deserved better from me." Mitchell stepped forward and bowed formally. "Your Majesty's apology is accepted with gratitude." But Charlotte wasn't finished. "However, I want everyone in this room to understand that while my actions were inexcusable, the frustrations that led to them were real and must be addressed." She looked around the room, making eye contact with staff members at all levels. "For too long, we have operated under systems that prioritize tradition over effectiveness, protocol over purpose. This morning's incident was a wake-up call that we all need to hear." The announcement of the new Protocol Review Committee and Charlotte's role as chair was met with surprised murmurs. Many staff members seemed cautiously optimistic about the prospect of having input into the systems that governed their daily work. "Change is never easy," Charlotte concluded, "especially in an institution as historic as this one. But if we don't adapt and evolve, we risk becoming irrelevant to the very people we serve." As the meeting dispersed, Charlotte was surprised by the number of staff members who approached her privately to express support for both her apology and her commitment to reform. The younger employees in particular seemed energized by the prospect of modernization. Later that evening, as Charlotte reflected on the day's events in her private study, she received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Davies, the head housekeeper who had been among the most critical of the morning's incident, knocked on her door. "Your Majesty," the older woman said after being admitted, "I wanted to say that while I was shocked by what happened this morning, your handling of it this afternoon showed real character." Charlotte was touched by the gesture from someone she knew had initially disapproved of her actions. "Thank you, Mrs. Davies, that means a great deal coming from you." The housekeeper nodded. "I've been here 30 years and I've seen royals who thought they were above accountability. You showed today that you're different." Over the following weeks, the incident that could have destroyed Charlotte's reputation instead became the catalyst for meaningful change within the palace. The Protocol Review Committee met regularly, with staff members feeling genuinely heard for the first time in years. Security procedures were streamlined to allow for more authentic public engagement while maintaining necessary safety measures. Sergeant Mitchell, rather than harboring resentment, became one of Charlotte's most effective collaborators in the reform process. His security expertise, combined with her vision for modernization, created solutions that neither could have achieved alone. The media coverage, while initially sensational, gradually shifted toward praising the royal family's transparency and willingness to evolve. Editorial writers noted that Charlotte's public apology and the subsequent reforms demonstrated a level of accountability rarely seen in public institutions. 6 months later, Charlotte stood in the pediatric cancer ward of the Children's Hospital, spending unscripted time with young patients and their families. Sergeant Mitchell stood nearby, but his presence felt protective rather than restrictive. The new protocols allowed for genuine human connection while maintaining appropriate security. As she held the hand of a 7-year-old girl receiving chemotherapy, Charlotte reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Her loss of control in the palace corridor had been her lowest point as a royal, but it had also forced conversations that needed to happen. The little girl looked up at her with curious eyes. "Are you really a queen?" Charlotte smiled, feeling more authentically royal in that moment than she ever had while following rigid protocols. "I'm trying to be the best queen I can be. Some days I do better than others." The child nodded seriously. "My mummy says everyone makes mistakes sometimes. The important thing is learning from them." As Charlotte continued her visit, moving freely through the ward and connecting with families in ways that had previously been impossible, she realized that her moment of terrible judgment had ultimately taught her the most important lesson of her royal career. True authority comes not from enforcing tradition, but from having the courage to change when change is needed. The palace corridors, that had once felt like a prison, now felt like home to a queen, consort who had learned that sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to serve the people who matter most. Her bold move had shocked everyone, but it had also opened doors to a more authentic and effective form of royal service that would benefit the monarchy for generations to come.